Hello, and welcome to the HHH podcast, where we talk about the horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and I'm excited to have you guys here today. We love talking about these horrible humans, and if you're having a good time, make sure you're sharing this with people that you think would enjoy all of these spooky, scary stories. Also, follow me on Instagram because I do show pictures of these individuals as well as sometimes crime scene photos. I don't let them be too graphic because that's yucky. But yeah, definitely check that out. Anyways, welcome today, guys. I'm really excited for our next individual. It's probably someone that very few of you have heard about. So that's why I'm excited to share a little bit about her. We are going to the slavery South in the United States. And, you know, we hear a lot about slavery, and slavery is horrible and an awful thing. It's something that's actually taken place throughout history on every continent. Like the Chinese people enslaved others from Asia. The Ottoman Empire actually loved Germanic people for their slaves. They loved to have white slaves. And of course, the Africans who sold their own into slavery to Europeans, Americans, Brazilians, Haitians, and the Caribbean islands. So we are going to be talking about a specific slave owner because, you know, anyone who owns slaves, even currently, anyone involved in that is a pretty despicable person. Let's be honest. How you can own another human is beyond me. But today, we're talking about someone who takes that horribleness and awfulness to a whole new level. Her name is Madame Delphine Lalorie, or Madame Blanc. She is from the French Quarter in New Orleans, and we're going to talk about what makes her so horrible. In fact, she's so bad that it's reported that her mansion that still exists is one of the most haunted places in one of the most haunted cities in the United States of America. So join me today as we talk about Madame Delphine Lalorie, and you'll get to experience me talking a little bit of French. Wish me luck on that, but let's jump in and learn more about her twisted life. Lalorie obviously was not born Madame Lalorie. She was actually born Marie Delphine McCarty on March 19th, 1787, as part of a really powerful family. The McCarty family, the McCarty clan, was actually pretty powerful. They had a lot of family members that were military officers, merchants, planters, and more importantly, and this will be super helpful for her later in life, government officials. So she was born in New Orleans in Spanish Louisiana of Louis Bartholomew de McCarty. His father actually had just moved them there from Ireland in 1730. So they'd only been in New Orleans for a short amount of time considering. So they still, you know, had a lot of strong Irish ties. And her mother's name was Marie Jean L'Arable, also known as the Widow Lecomotte. Due to being this was actually her second marriage. So she was known as a widow, even though she was remarried. So both her mother and father were very predominant members of the European Creole community. Her uncle was actually the governor of the Spanish American province of Louisiana and Florida. in 1785 and 1791. So, like I said, she's got some powerful people in her family and very predominant in the community. So everybody knows who they are. And she is accustomed to people knowing who she was. So her cousin was actually the mayor of New Orleans from 1815 to 1820. And when Delphine was 4 years old, something really significant happened in history that would affect her everyday life, but not directly. So when she was 4, a Haitian revolution erupted. So in 1791, this was the slaves of Haiti rising in revolt against their owners, and this was the largest slave uprising since Spartacus rose against the Roman Republic. So this was huge, and they actually were successful at overturning their slave owners and the government and started their own government. So this was really powerful and swept across the South like wildfire. A lot of slave owners became very scared that their slaves would also rise up and resist against them. So this gave them, I guess, license to be a little more cruel than they would have been to their slaves because of their fear that they would rise up. And this is kind of the atmosphere that Delphine was raised in. She was only 4 years old. She was used to the fear of losing the slaves and treating them cruelly. And that will come into play later in life. This next event had a severe impact on her, which also probably impacted her behavior later in life. Her uncle had actually been killed in 1771 by his slaves because of multiple rebellions. He ended up dying because of some of these rebellions. So a lot of people, especially the slave owners, were terrified that something bad was going to happen. And I mean, bad obviously depends on who's writing the history, right? But on June 11th, 1800, at the ripe old age, she was so old when this happened. When she was 13, she married her first husband, Don Ramon de Lepo y Angulo, a high-ranking Spanish official. So he was actually a Spanish royal officer. He was super high-ranking. And in 1804, Delphine got pregnant with their first child, and her husband were called to the royal court in Madrid, Spain. So they crossed the ocean, went to Madrid, and while there in Spain, her husband actually ended up passing away when his boat that he was sailing in actually hit a sandbar off of the coast of Havana. So her first husband died only about 4 years after they had been married. So she was a widow at 17. Did I do my math right? Is that right? Yeah. At the age of 17, she was already a widow. And she would give birth to their daughter just a few weeks after his death. And both her and her daughter would return home to New Orleans to be with her family because she was alone in Spain. So about 4 years later, she waited about 4 years. At age 21 in 1808, she remarried for the second time to husband Jean Blanc. He was a prominent baker, or not baker. He was not a baker. He was a banker with an N, banker. He was a merchant, a lawyer, and a legislator. And he actually purchased a giant villa for the Blanc family to live in. And they ended up having 4 children together. In total, Delphine would end up having 6 children altogether. 6 children. But in 1816, only 8 years after marrying her husband, he actually would pass away at the age of 50. So she's not having super great luck with husbands, but she waited a little bit longer this time, but she remarried again to her third and final husband on June 25th, 1825. And she married Leonard Louis Nicholas Lalorie, who was 15 years younger than her. So that marriage was a little bit tumultuous. I'll just say that they had a hard time getting along. And in 1832, their marriage was really falling apart to the point that Delphine petitioned the first judicial court to receive a separation from her husband so they could no longer live together. But the court denied it. And I do find it ironic because this is what she told the court, and I quote, "He treated her in such a manner as to render their living together unsupportable." She thought that he was very emotionally unsupportive and abusive and those kinds of things, which is super ironic when we find out what she did herself. Well, in 1831, she actually purchased her own property. So I'm kind of going back in time a year. She had purchased her own property that she actually managed on her own. It was a mansion. It became known as the Lalorie Mansion. It was in the heart of New Orleans, French Quarter. This was what she managed. This is what she did with her time. And they had an attached slave quarters to this home. And they had many, many Black slaves. This home would be the center of many of the horrendous crimes that she would commit throughout her life. So we're going to explore this mansion and what she did in it. So Delphine and Leonard actually owned many men and women slaves. They had a couple children as slaves, but it was mostly men and women. And in public, it was very strange. Delphine was very kind to slaves. She was very civil, never mistreated her slaves in public, actually showed a lot of respect for African Americans in the community and in the public. And so she seemed very kind and very sweet and very caring. But when it comes to how she treated her slaves in private, that was a different story. So in the early 1830s, rumors started swirling around the French Quarter about Delphine and potentially her husband's involvement, but mostly Delphine and how she treated the slaves. Although this was the South, slavery South, there actually was an agreement and some laws about how you could treat your slave. And a lot of people did not believe in mistreating your slaves. They really frowned upon that, which is shocking. It was very surprising for me to learn that because I feel like it's so dehumanizing to have slaves in the first place that it would seem like you wouldn't really have a moral standard as far as how you treated them. But I guess if you think about it as they saw these people as almost like cattle, like property like that, they would want to treat them with a certain amount of, not respect, but like treat them well, right? So there was an agreement throughout society that you don't treat your slaves a certain way. And there were even laws against certain ways you could treat your slaves. They were allowed to physically discipline their slaves, but they could not be excessive with this discipline. They could not go over the top. Now, what does excessive mean? Because from all the things that I've heard about slavery, it's all excessive. But different time, different place. I didn't live there. I don't know. I'm not justifying it in any way. I think it's horrendous how everyone was treated as slaves. But they apparently did have a standard that you could not be excessive. Who knows what that means? But rumors really started to take off that Delphine was horrendous to her slaves, so much so that it actually triggered an investigation at least twice, that 2 different court representatives would come to the Lalorie home and check on the situation and remind them that these laws exist and you cannot be excessively brutal to the slaves you own. So that would calm them down for a little bit, so the rumors would kind of die down, simmer down, and then obviously it would get worse again. There's a story, though, that, and claims that people have witnessed this, that there was a little girl that they saw being chased around the yard in the Lalorie home. And Delphine had a whip and was chasing this little girl, probably about 12-year-old girl. Her name was Leah or Leia. Not sure which one. They weren't really clear on specifically which one it was, but it is either Leah or Leia. She was 12, and she was so afraid of being punished by Delphine that she ran to the roof of the house. Now, this mansion is a 3-story mansion, and it's massive, okay? It's really tall. And this girl ran to the top of the building to get away from Delphine because she was so scared of being punished. And people believe that the little girl was either pushed or jumped to escape Delphine and ended up dying. So I actually have quotes from people who may have witnessed it. And it says that she saw a small child, quote, flying across the yard towards the house, and Madame Lalorie pursuing her, cowhide in hand. And eventually the two ended up on the roof of the 3-story mansion, and she heard the fall and saw the child taken up, her body bending and limbs hanging as if every bone were broken. And at night, she saw the body brought out, a shallow hole dug by torchlight, and the body covered up. So, it said that the reason that this incident occurred, and I found this so ironic, because as I was reading this, I'm like, oh, this sounds really familiar. The little girl was brushing Delphine's hair. You hear what I'm hearing? Brushing Delphine's hair. And actually, it hit a snarl and made Delphine's head kind of jerk a little bit. And Delphine became enraged. And that is what set her off to chase this little girl with a whip and ended up killing this girl. All because she was brushing her hair and hit a tangle. Doesn't this story sound familiar? Like we've talked about it with another individual? I don't know, like Elizabeth Bathory. All these women are crazy. It's all the brushing of the hair. They just needed to not have anyone brush their hair. Anyways, so that story happened, and after an official investigation was launched because the officials heard about this story and were mortified, they launched an official investigation into the Lalories to find out what was really happening with their slaves. And it ended up causing the Lalories to give up 9 slaves. They had 9 slaves removed from their ownership. But Delphine would not have that. Remember how I mentioned at the very beginning that she had a lot of family and power? Well, she used those connections and had her family, different parts of her family, purchase those slaves that had been removed from her home and had them returned to her. So unfortunately, those individuals who they thought they had escaped this nightmare that they were living were brought right back to this home of tortures. So there are also allegations that Delphine would punish her own children if she saw any of them being kind or exhibiting any kind of kindness, giving them food or anything to the slaves that the Lalories owned. It said that Delphine would actually beat her own children as well. So she had no bias on who she would take her punishments out on. And I'm sure that what she did to her daughters was nothing compared to what she does to her slaves. But the fact that she didn't want them showing any kindness to these individuals is just sickening. Now, between 1830 and 1834, it's actually documented, you can look this up on the state records, that at least 12 slaves died in the Lalorie mansion. Those individuals included a woman named Bonnie, a cook and a laundress named Juliet, and her 4 children. Florence, who was 10, Jules, who was 6, and Leonite, I think is how you say their name, as age 4. And some people say that an illness swept through the home and that's what killed all of these people. But that theory has been very, very hard to prove. And with the rest of the information that we're about to get into, very hard to believe. Because, as I said, we're about to get into the gnarly part of this story. So in April of 1834, so on April 10th, Delphine and her husband were actually hosting a party. And the guests of this party remember that there was a moment where Delphine was not happy. She was very upset and got up and left the room to the kitchen. Well, while she was gone, they heard a lot of noises like shoutings and maybe even some like physical blows taking place. But soon Delphine returned to her guests and just, no big deal. I was just checking on something, everything's fine. Carry on, that kind of attitude. Just like brushing off what just happened. All of her guests just kind of, okay, we'll just continue on with our party. Well, soon thereafter, a fire actually broke out in the Lalorie mansion. This fire started in the kitchen where Madame Lalorie had come from. And when authorities finally arrived and started to fight the fire, they went into the kitchen and found a 70-year-old Black woman chained to the stove by her ankle. And when they talked to this woman, she said that she was the cook and that she actually had started the fire herself in an attempt to kill herself because she was so afraid of the punishment that Delphine was going to administer to her once the party was over. So Delphine had gone back into the kitchen because she had been upset with the cook and let her know in no small terms what was going to be waiting for her. Now, while the authorities were talking to this woman, she disclosed that up in the attic is where all those who were truly punished were brought, and everyone feared the attic so much because if you went up into the attic, you were never seen again. And so this, kind of definitely worried the people that had come to help. So they started trying to clear out the mansion and went up to the uppermost rooms of the mansion, and they tried to get in, but the door was locked. And so they demanded that the Lalories give them the key. And Delphine and her husband utterly refused. They would not give the authorities the keys to open the door to that uppermost room. So eventually, bystanders that were there just broke down the door. They just tore it down. And when they did, they were horrified at what they found. They found at least 7 slaves, more or less horribly mutilated, suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extreme to the other. It seemed like they had actually been imprisoned in that attic for months. And that was a report directly from the New Orleans Bee. So that was a quote straight from the newspaper when this happened. A lot of the individuals that they found were actually wearing spiked collars that restricted their head movement. So if they tried to look one way or another way or anything like that, it would stab into their neck. So they were just stuck with their head in a stationary position, or else they would be severely injured. They also found individuals who were so severely whipped and beaten that their backs were actually filleted open, like you would fillet a fish. That was their back. And it was from whipping that this had happened. They even found one woman who had been placed in a small cage. Like, think of a small dog kennel, small dog cage that you would leave your dog in while you were gone or something. Think of something like that. She was shoved into one of these things, and it was small enough that they actually had to break her limbs to get her to fit in this tiny cage. And she had been in there long enough that her bones and breaks had actually healed. And they had healed in a way that made her look not as a human anymore. She looked more like a lizard. And they had to cut her out of that thing. They were all emaciated with hunger. I meant emaciated. Sorry. They were all starving and skin and bones. There was even a little boy. It said that his head, half of his face was missing, the skin down to the muscle. And you could see the veins and stuff on his face. Half of that was missing. And there were even rumors that there were dead bodies found in the attic, with their corpses mutilated but beyond recognition. So this attic just held horrors. And the things they did to these people were just horrendous. There's no other word, just horrendous. Judge Jean Francos Cogne, he actually was a government official that came to the mansion. And when he entered the mansion, he said he found a woman wearing an iron collar and an old woman who had received a very deep wound on her head and who was too weak to walk. Now, Delphine's husband was asked at this time, as they're saving all these people from this burning building and finding these horrors, they asked Delphine's husband, what have you guys done to your slaves? What happened? Why do they look like this? What have you done? And, his response makes me angry. Oh, I'm so angry. He said, and I quote, "Some people had better stay at home rather than come to others' houses to dictate laws and meddle with other people's business." No shame. He didn't even care. He was more mad that these individuals were in his home discovering their dirty little secret. He didn't even care that he was being exposed as a brutal, sadistic man. He was just mad that their secret had been found out and it wasn't anybody else's business. Oh my word. That is just, it makes me so mad. Well, it didn't just make me mad. Oh, no. No. So this part of the story I found fascinating because I wouldn't have expected this. As word spread around the town of the horrible conditions that all of these slaves were found in and just the brutality that they had faced, a mob actually started to form throughout the town. Like, all the townspeople started to come together and they were furious. They were so angry. And back then, when you hear the word a mob started to form, those are not good words. My own ancestors faced a lot of mobs, and I will tell you right now, they are not friendly, and they are not controllable, and they're usually out for blood. And that is exactly what happened in this situation. This mob began to form around the Lalorie mansion, and they wanted justice for all of the people that Delphine had harmed. They were seething mad and wanted blood. And it said that Delphine actually tried to flee in her carriage and barely made it out because people were grabbing at it, trying to knock it over, and she barely escaped with her life. And that night, her house ended up being demolished and destroyed, everything upon which they could lay their hands on. They basically, with their bare hands, tore down this house. And it even, in the newspaper that I had quoted earlier, it even said that they left scarcely anything remained but the walls. They destroyed that house. And then they set it on fire. Now, I know I said at the beginning that her mansion is one of the most haunted places in New Orleans, which is the most haunted city in the United States. And that is true, because it did get rebuilt. But at this moment, they totally burned it to the ground because it was a mob. They needed vengeance. They needed something. The next part of this story also made me angry. Even though the slaves were saved from these horrendous conditions, instead of treating them and taking them somewhere where they could heal and, recover from the ordeal that they've been in, that is not what happened. Guys, I swear, it's just so maddening. What they did to these victims, they took them to the police station and put them out on display for public viewing. So people could come, check out their bodies, check out their injuries, look to see what happened to them, like some kind of sideshow. Like I said, instead of healing them and helping them recover, they put them on display for 4,000 people to come and see, to, quote, convince themselves of their suffering. They couldn't just believe them. They couldn't just hear the story and be like, oh, that is horrible. Why would anyone ever do that? No. They put them on display like a freaking sideshow, and it rage. It makes no sense. Why would you do that? 2 of the slaves that they actually rescued ended up dying very soon after their rescue. So 2 of them tragically lost their lives after finally being freed from the grasps of Delphine and her husband. Now, after everything had happened and things kind of calmed down, the investigation continued into what went on in the Delphine Lalorie mansion. And they ended up digging up many bodies around the grounds of the Lalorie mansion. including that of a small child. So a lot of people believe that the child was the little girl that fell off the roof, but there's no way to substantiate that. But they did find quite a few bodies around the Lalorie property. So this, I know I've said that I have been angry, but this is when I start getting really angry in this story and what happens. So you're probably wondering, Delphine fled. What happened to her? Where did she face comeuppance, right? Here's the twist of the story. So Delphine and her family actually fled from New Orleans that night of the fire. Like, they went to the docks, caught a boat, and just peaced out and never returned to face justice. They never had to face justice. Never. In fact, they fled all the way to Paris. So even if someone had caught her, they couldn't extradite her. She's too far away. She's in Paris. No one is going to find her that would be able to punish her. And she would live there with her mother and two sisters. And her mother never found out the reason why she fled to Paris. She never told her why she fled so quickly from New Orleans to come live with her in Paris. Her mother just assumed, well, I guess this is what you're wanting to do now. Like, you must have thought this through. She had no idea that her daughter was a sadistic torturer of other human beings. Which is so sad. Because, once they both got to the other side, her mom found out and she would be very upset. Anyways, Delphine, would tell her sons many, many times that she was planning on returning to New Orleans soon. She planned on coming back, and she still wanted to live her life there, and she wanted to come back to New Orleans because she missed it. She never did. She never returned because she knew what was there waiting for her. She knew justice would be there, and those mobs that came that night would be there. But she never returned. She wasn't brave enough to face the music of her action. So her death is kind of a mystery. They don't know for sure how she died or when she died. But I genuinely want to believe this first story. And I'm going to go with this first one because it would just be so epic and poetic if this is how she actually died. So some believe that she actually died while out boar hunting. It's said that she went on a hunting trip and that she was mauled to death by a wild boar. I want to believe that so bad. That would be at least a small, tiny form of justice for the things that she did. But that's not what everyone believes. Because in the late 1930s, so almost 100 years after the time she fled from New Orleans, there was a copper plate actually discovered in a cemetery that reads, and here goes my French, guys. Don't make fun of me. I only took one class in high school, so if I pronounce something wrong, blame my French teacher in high school, okay? So this is what the plaque read. It said, Madame Lalorie ne Marie Delphine McCarthy décédée à Paris le 7 December 1842. I don't know how to say the numbers. Missed those lessons in high school. But basically it's saying that she died in Paris in 1842 at the age of 55. But there's also French archives in Paris saying that she died on December 7th, 1849 at the age of 62. So there's a lot of mystery about her death and what actually happened to her. I'm going to go with the wild boar story just because, like I said, there's got to be some form of justice for what she did. She treated other human beings so horribly that it would serve her right to be mauled to death by a pig in the wild. I think that is what should have happened to her. So I'm going to say that the plaque they found in the cemetery, probably the right age, but she was hunting and got killed by a boar. Well, we're going to go with that one. So Delphine's story kind of continues on today, even though she passed away. Her home is one of the most visited, most haunted spots in New Orleans. Now, I don't know if you believe in ghosts or if you don't believe in ghosts or whatever, to each his own. I feel like when stuff that's really bad happens in certain places, it can retain that kind of energy and keep those feelings, those evil feelings, still in that place. I felt that way when I visited Gettysburg for the first time. You can ask my parents, they still tease me about this, but I could not get out of the car because the weight of that place was just so heavy. So heavy, you just knew a lot of people had died there. And I feel like that would be the same walking into the Lalorie mansion. Although it's not the same wood and mortar and stone, it was rebuilt on the same land that all of these horrible things happened. And I think it probably retained that bad juju because it was so bad. Well, a lot of ghost hunters go to this mansion. I even tried to watch, as I was doing my research, I was looking for a documentary on Delphine, and all they had was almost like Blair Witch Project. It was a bunch of college kids going to the Lalorie home and spending the night and seeing if they could catch any ghosts on video. It was really cheesy and really dumb. Don't watch it. But there's a lot of ghost investigators that come to that place and people that will stay there because it's changed what it's been over the years. But they claim that you can hear the moans and the screams and the cries of the slaves as they're being tortured. They say that you can hear doors slamming on their own. Faucets will suddenly turn on. The furniture moves on its own. They've seen body imprints on empty beds that no one has slept in or touched in a very long time. They even say they've seen the slaves, some even wearing chains, walking around the property. Now, like I said, I don't know if you believe in ghosts or not, but her and her husband did some pretty terrible things, so I'm sure that bad energy is still around that place. But it is somewhere that you can still go and visit, and it's undeniable that Delphine Lalorie, or Delphine McCarthy, was a really horrible human. The things that she did to slaves, even other slave owners thought it was bad. I just keep thinking of that woman stuffed in that cage. The perspective of someone in that situation is just horrendous. And her own slave tried to commit suicide to get away from her. A little girl jumped off the roof of a building to get away from her. She was a horrible person. And that's why she is our horrible human in history this week. Because she took something that is so bad in and of itself, just owning other humans, and made it so much worse. She used her power to get her slaves back so she could torture them. She used her ability to own others as an excuse to treat others so poorly that other slave owners wanted to kill her for the bad treatment. It's mind-blowing to me. Anyways, so next week, guys, we are going to be diving back into another dictator. So buckle up, because I'm sure a lot of you have heard the name of this individual, but the craziest thing about this next person that we're going to talk about is they were only a dictator. They were only in charge for a grand total of 4 years. That's it. 4 years. And do you want to know the damage that they caused? Oh, of course you want to know. That's why you're listening, right? They caused the death of more than 1 million people. Like, Idi Amin had a few years, and he only did like 500,000 people, which is still a crazy amount of death. But this individual, 4 years, 1 million people. That is just mind-blowing to me. But what we are going to be talking about, the individual that we will be talking about next week, is the infamous and well-known Pol Pot. So tune in next week, because we're going to go for a wild ride and figure out how this dictator was able to accomplish in 4 years the death of over 1 million people. So thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the story of Delphine Lalorie, or Delphine, hold on, I gotta say her name correct, Marie Delphine McCarty, and her tale of how she managed to take one of the worst chapters in human history and make it so much worse. So thanks for joining me today on HHH. Make sure you are liking, make sure you subscribe, and be sure you're sharing this with your friends. If you like this kind of content, I'm sure some of your friends would like it too. So we will see you guys next week, and we will talk to you soon.